The rope burns on her wrists told a story Thomas McKenna didn't want to read. She sat bound to the fence post behind his barn, her dress torn at the shoulder, dark hair matted with dust, and something that might have been blood. When she lifted her head, her eyes weren't filled with fear. They held something far more dangerous. Recognition. "Untie me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept across his property, but gently. Thomas stood frozen, his hand halfway to the knife on his belt. He'd come out to check on his horses, and found her there, trussed up like livestock, left for him to discover. The knots were military precise, the kind he'd seen during his years in the cavalry. Professional work. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would change everything. She studied his face with those pale green eyes, searching for something. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words hit him like a fist to the chest. He did remember, fragments, pieces of a life he'd tried to bury, a mission gone wrong, a village that wasn't supposed to be there, orders that should never have been given. "Sarah," he breathed. Her smile was bitter as prairie wind. "Sarah Whitehorse. Though I suppose you knew me as something else back then." His hands shook as he cut the first rope. She was supposed to be dead. They were all supposed to be dead. That's what the report had said. What Colonel Hayes had sworn was the only way to keep the peace. A clean slate. No witnesses. "How long have you been looking for me?" Thomas asked, soaring through the bindings around her ankles. 5 years, since the day you rode away and left my family bleeding in the dirt." The rope fell away, and she rubbed her wrists, never taking her eyes off him. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, though the sky was clear. Not thunder, horses riding hard. "They're coming," Sarah said, rising to her feet with predatory grace. "The same men who tied me here, the same men who've been hunting you." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair, the copper of dried blood on her skin. "The question is, Thomas McKenna, are you going to run again?" Thomas backed toward the barn, his mind racing. The riders were still distant, but closing fast. Maybe a dozen horses, maybe more. Sarah stood between him and his house, between him and his rifle, watching him with those unforgiving eyes. "You could have killed me while I was tied up," he said, testing her intentions. "Why didn't you?" "Because I want you to choose." Her voice carried the weight of 5 years' worth of pain. "I want you to decide who you really are. The man who followed orders, or the man who could have said no." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Thomas could make out individual riders now. 6 men in cavalry blues, led by someone whose silhouette made his blood run cold. Colonel Hayes, still hunting, still cleaning up loose ends. "They're not here to arrest you," Sarah continued. "They're here to finish what they started. You know too much about what really happened at Standing Rock Creek." Thomas's neighbors had always wondered why a man with his education had chosen to ranch in the middle of nowhere. They'd accepted his story about wanting a quiet life after the war. They didn't know about the massacre, about the women and children who died because someone had decided peace was worth any price. "If I help you," he said, "if I stand and fight, what then? What happens to the life I've built here? Maybe you built it on a lie." Sarah's words cut deep. "Maybe you don't deserve the peace you stole from others." The first shot cracked across the prairie, splintering wood near Thomas's head. Hayes had spotted them. Sarah dove for cover behind a water trough, moving like someone who'd learned to survive in hard country. "Choose, Thomas," she called out over the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "Run like you did before, or stay and face what you've done." Another bullet whined past his ear. Thomas looked at his house, at the life he'd carefully constructed mile by mile, fence post by fence post. Then he looked at Sarah, crouched behind the trough with her torn dress and bound wrists, and saw his sister's face, his mother's face, every innocent person who'd ever trusted him to do the right thing. The riders were close enough now that he could see Hayes' silver mustache, could recognize the faces of men who'd sworn the same oath he had, to protect and serve, to honor the uniform. Thomas ran, not toward his horse, not toward the distant hills, but toward the barn where his Winchester waited. The barn doors slammed shut behind Thomas just as the first riders thundered into his yard. Dust clouds billowed past the windows, and through the gaps in the wood, he could see Hayes dismounting with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this before. "McKenna," The colonel's voice boomed across the prairie. "We know you're in there. We know what she told you." Thomas pressed his back against the barn wall, Winchester heavy in his hands. Through a knothole he watched Sarah rise from behind the water trough, her hands visible, empty. She was surrendering, or pretending to. "Colonel Hayes," she called out, her voice steady despite everything. "Still cleaning up your messes, I see." Hayes walked toward her with that same measured stride Thomas remembered from a dozen morning inspections. "Miss Whitehorse, you've caused us considerable trouble. We thought you'd learn to leave the past buried. Some graves won't stay closed." The other soldiers had spread out in a loose circle around the barn and house, professional, patient. They knew Thomas had nowhere to run. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and his horse was in the corral, well within rifle range. "You have something that belongs to the army," Hayes continued, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Documents, evidence, things that could hurt a lot of good men." "Good men don't massacre children," Sarah spat. The colonel's hand moved to his sidearm with practiced ease. "Good men follow orders. Good men understand that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Through the barn wall, Thomas could hear everything: the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the whispered commands as Hayes positioned his men. They were going to burn him out. Standard procedure when a fort was compromised. "Where is it, Sarah?" Hayes asked, his voice growing cold. "The dispatch, the real report about Standing Rock Creek. I mailed it to the territorial governor 3 days ago." Her lie was beautiful, confident, along with witness statements, photographs of the bodies. Hayes struck her across the face with the back of his hand, a casual violence that sent her sprawling. "You always were a poor liar." That's when Thomas saw the smoke. One of the soldiers had circled behind the barn with a torch. Orange flames licked at the dry wood near the rear door, spreading fast in the afternoon wind. The fire wasn't just meant to flush him out, it was meant to destroy everything. The evidence Sarah had hidden, the proof of what really happened 5 years ago. Even Thomas himself if necessary. Hayes had learned from his mistakes. This time there would be no witnesses left alive to ask inconvenient questions. Thomas looked down at the Winchester in his hands, then at the growing fire behind him. 6 soldiers, 1 aging rancher, a woman with secrets worth killing for. The smoke was getting thicker now, and soon he'd have to choose between suffocation and stepping into Hayes's crosshairs. The heat was becoming unbearable when Thomas heard Sarah's voice, low and urgent, cutting through the smoke. "The root cellar, behind the potatoes. There's a tunnel." She was pressed against the barn wall now, just outside the flames' reach, speaking through a gap in the boards. Hayes and his men were focused on the fire, waiting for their trap to spring shut. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas whispered back, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "Because I saw you hesitate that day at Standing Rock Creek. When Hayes gave the order to fire on the children, you lowered your rifle, for maybe 3 seconds, but I saw." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had hesitated. In the chaos and confusion, with bullets flying and orders being shouted, he'd seen a little girl clutching a corn-husk doll and couldn't pull the trigger. By the time Hayes noticed and screamed at him to shoot, someone else had already done it. "That hesitation cost my family their lives," Sarah continued, her voice thick with old pain. "But it also told me you weren't like the others. You were just afraid." Thomas crawled toward the root cellar, staying low beneath the thickening smoke. The tunnel Sarah mentioned was barely wide enough for a man, an old escape route dug by the previous owner during Apache raids. "There's something else," Sarah said as he reached the cellar entrance. "Something you need to know about that day." "What?" Thomas paused, 1 foot on the ladder leading down. "Your sister Emily, the one whose letters you kept reading by the campfire. She didn't die of pneumonia like you were told." Sarah's words came fast now, urgent. "Hayes had her killed when she started asking questions about your discharge, about why you came home so broken." The world tilted. Thomas gripped the ladder so hard his knuckles went white. Emily, who'd written him every week during the war. Emily, who'd planned to name her first child after him. Emily, who'd been the only family he had left. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I thought you deserved to know the truth before." A shadow fell across the barn door. Hayes had grown impatient. "Burn it all," he commanded. The woman too. Make it look like they died in the fire together. Thomas looked at Sarah through the gap in the boards. Her face was sooty, her lip bleeding from Hayes's blow, but her eyes were fierce with something beyond hatred. Justice maybe, or just the determination to see this through to the end. The dispatch is hidden in the old oak tree, 2 miles north, she said quietly. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Thomas said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Not again, not while I can still do something about it. He descended into the tunnel, but not to escape. To circle around behind Hayes's men, to end this the way it should have ended 5 years ago. The tunnel emerged in the creek bed, 50 yards from the barn. Thomas could see Hayes silhouetted against the flames, could see his men positioned around the property like pieces on a chessboard. They thought they'd won. They thought the past was finally buried. Thomas rose from the tall grass with his Winchester leveled at Hayes's chest. Let her go, Colonel. Hayes turned slowly, unsurprised. I wondered when you'd find your spine, McKenna. 5 years too late, but better than never. It's over, Thomas said, stepping closer. Sarah mailed copies of everything to the territorial governor, the War Department, 3 newspapers. Your war's finally caught up with you. Hayes laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. You think anyone cares about a handful of dead Indians, about one scared soldier's conscience? He gestured to his men. These boys have families to feed, pensions to earn. They'll swear I died a hero if that's what it takes. Maybe, Thomas agreed, but they'll have to live with the truth. That's when Sarah moved. She'd picked up a burning brand from the barn and hurled it into the hay wagon, where Hayes kept his supplies. The explosion of flame and smoke scattered the horses, sent the soldiers diving for cover. In the chaos, Thomas kept his rifle trained on Hayes. You killed my sister. You killed innocent people, and you've been hunting me like an animal for 5 years because you were afraid I'd tell the truth. The truth. Hayes' voice cracked like a whip. The truth is that we prevented a war. We saved hundreds of lives by sacrificing a few. That's what soldiers do, McKenna. We make the hard choices so others don't have to. No, Thomas said quietly. That's what cowards do. They hide behind orders and uniforms and tell themselves they had no choice. Hayes drew his sidearm, but Thomas was faster. The Winchester's report echoed across the prairie like thunder. Hayes fell backward into the dust, his silver mustache dark with blood. The other soldiers lowered their weapons. Without their leader, without the certainty that comes from following orders, they looked like what they really were. Tired men in dirty uniforms far from home. Ride out, Thomas told them, all of you, before the territorial marshal gets here. They did, leaving Hayes's body behind like discarded equipment. Sarah walked toward Thomas through the smoke and settling dust. Her face was streaked with soot, her dress torn, but she stood straight as a cavalry saber. What happens now? She asked. Thomas looked at his burning barn, at the life he'd built on a foundation of guilt and silence. Now we tell the truth, all of it, starting with Standing Rock Creek and ending here. And then we see what's left when the lies burn away. Years later Sarah would remember this moment, the way the smoke curled up into the endless prairie sky, the way Thomas had finally stopped running from who he was, the way 2 broken people had found something worth saving in the ashes of their shared past. The barn burned to nothing but blackened timbers, but Thomas McKenna rebuilt it stronger than before, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind carried the scent of sage across the grassland, Sarah Whitehorse would ride out from town to help him with the horses. 2 survivors, learning that some wounds could heal if you were brave enough to let them. The old oak tree, 2 miles north, still stands, but it no longer holds any secrets.